Yeah, I moved to the city in 1980.
1980.
Started visiting here, and my first trip to New York was 71, actually. So,
And so where are you from, and where did you move here from?
I'm from upstate New York, a little town called Greene, New York, named after Nathaniel Greene. It's near Binghamton, kind of in between Binghamton and Ithaca, where Cornell University is. So small town.
Okay.
Relatives were farmers. Went to graduate school. I went to State University at Oneonta as an undergrad. Then I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder for a master's in public administration. Worked for the Boulder County Sheriff's Department for a year, and then the City of Boulder Personnel Department for a couple of years, and then moved to New York City.
The Sheriff's Department.
Yeah.
We're going to have to talk about that some other time. I didn't know that. Okay, so you moved here from Boulder.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so can you tell us what it was like? Why did you move to New York, and what was the city like around that time? What did it feel like?
Well, I had visited New York a lot as a undergrad at Oneonta, because a lot of my roommates were either from Brooklyn or Canarsie, actually, or from Long Island. And on Long Island, I was on the wrestling team. One of my teammates was in Sayville, which is on the South Shore, and it's right across the Great South Bay from Fire Island, where there's two gay communities, Cherry Grove and Fire Island Pines. And I'm a gay man, and really liked New York because of theater and museums, and it's a lot friendlier place, easier place to be gay in, and especially in 1980.
Yeah.
And really liked Fire Island, which I saw for the first time in 75 when I was still in college, undergrad. And so the big city brought me here, largely because I was gay, and about the only place you could be gay in the 70s was New York or San Francisco. So.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions about that time in New York that you would want to ask? Just general questions about 1980, New York City?
It was right when Ronald Reagan got elected. If any of you watch old TV, there was a show called Dynasty, which was kind of like Dallas. It was about rich. That one was set in Colorado, but rich oil families fighting with each other, and it was a primetime soap opera. But that was a lot of the culture. Donald Trump was just hitting his stride then. Built first there's a hotel attached to Grand Central, the Hyatt, I think it's called, which he renovated from an old dump that nobody would stay in to a real glitzy, brassy, ugly thing. And that was, look at Donald Trump. So shortly thereafter, he built Trump Towers, and so it was all about glitz, big business, money was what it was all about, get your MBA, go, go, go. So the beginning of gentrification.
Right, so that makes sense, right, with what we've been discussing. We talked about the 70s and all the disinvestment and the abandonment of capital to the suburbs and just out of cities in general and out of public programs and public housing and public infrastructure. But then we've also been discussing the persistent role of real estate in New York City as an economic engine. Last week, I think, was when we talked about the growth machine as a concept. The city as a growth machine, an economic growth machine, and so we're all primed for that. We've just begun to talk about when the city then started to see a lot of reinvestment and speculative investment during that time, which coincided with when there was this shift. He mentioned Ronald Reagan coming into office. So there was a really conservative shift in national politics and federal government following, the era of the civil rights movement and all those things that we talked about. 1968 is this big, important peak year. So now there followed a lot of backlash against the gains that were made during that time. And so, it really was politically, it was a very interesting time, difficult time for progressive
human rights, social justice. And
right.
It was all about, the economy and big business and doing everything possible to, create economic growth and to favor big business, to favor real estate development, all kinds of tax incentive programs for the development of real estate, building of big buildings, hotels. It was kind of like the beginning of the transition of the Midtown 42nd Street area away from being a theater street, which had kind of degraded so that it was full of lots of dollar stores and porn movie theaters and
fun stuff.
Yeah. a lot of a bit grittier.
Gritty was the word.
Yeah, the time was the city was a lot more interesting then because there was lots of alternative theater and art was really important both in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, the beginning of the 60s, and so there were lots of small little music venues and arts theaters and theater workshops and porno movies and strip places and whatever, and there was all this kind of backlash against anything that wasn't Dynasty or Dallas and glitzy and proper, and so one by one a number of the old theater, small few-story theater buildings were torn down and monstrosities were built with tax incentives to big corporations to move their headquarters here.
So that sounds pretty familiar, right? Okay, so we have a good idea then of when it was that you came here and what it was like. So what did you do? I want to leave time to mostly talk about ACTA.
Sure.
But could you give us a little bit more about your time, what led up to your experience to getting involved with ACTA,
Sure.
helping to start ACTA?
Well, I'll make one more little bit of comments about
please.
the city. The city was really much more interesting then because you had all these neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods were kind of defined by what happened there and by who lived there. And so there was Chinatown and Little Italy based on the primary residents of that area, but there was also areas that housed industry. There was the fashion district, which was around 7th Avenue in Midtown primarily, and there were all these little manufacturing entities in office buildings or kind of more warehousey factory types of buildings, and they're literally, you used to see people pushing carts down the sidewalks where they would be taking a coat that had just been kind of cut and loosely stitched together to the place where they were going to put the braiding or the collar on, and then be pushed to the place that was going to put the buttons on, and you'd see fur coats getting pushed down the streets, or half-built dresses, or and there was one building had all the button businesses, and another one had all the collar, and another one had all the children's clothes, and another one had all the women's clothes, and there was an eggs district, there was a butter district, there was a meat packing district, there was the flour district, and there were, New York had these neighborhoods, and people would if a woman was a, homemaker, she literally might go to the, on a day stroll where she'd go to the butter district to get the butter, and the eggs district, and then to the meat packing district, and then to the flour district on her way home to prepare a meal. And all of these things were either made there, or they were brought in from upstate New York on farms or whatever, and then processed and then sent out of the city. So the economic engine was actually creating stuff and commerce and trade and import and export, and it was a city then. It was much more interesting. Now it's all just office buildings and people pushing paper and people pushing fake money transfers around, and glitzy stores selling stuff that was made in China. And And so, in the 70s and 80s, it was made in either Japan or Korea, based on wherever the cheapest labor, was. And so, that made the city far less interesting than it is now. I moved to New York mainly so that I, could be around gay people and not be, stigmatized. Colorado was great. I went there before I came out to ski, and I was a jock. I wrestled in college and played football and wrestled in high school. But I went there to ski and run and do kind of outdoor things. Then I figured out that I was gay, and there was like nobody gay there, and all the cowboys didn't like gay people too much, and so it was either moved to San Francisco or moved to New York. And I'm from New York and had friends here, so I came east. And I started working initially for American Standard Corporation. They make toilets, but a whole bunch of other stuff. Eventually from there I went to Citibank, started internal consulting, then went to a consulting firm. But then you couldn't really be out when you were in corporate America. You had to pretend you were gay. I mean, you weren't gay. You had to pretend you were straight. Lots of like fake girlfriends, and it was a really weird time. And then HIV hit, and it really exacerbated the stigma and the discrimination and the mistreatment of people with gay with AIDS, but also people who are gay. And AIDS was really a frightening disease, and there was lots of fear and stigma and hysteria created by HIV because it was a disease that was primarily hitting young men in kind of the height of their prowess. It was mainly people in their 20s that were getting or early 30s that were getting infected, and in the gay community, like being pretty and having a good body is like social capital. And so the people who like had the most sex were people who were going to the gym all the time and could get laid by going into a bar like that. And so they were the ones that were having the most sexual partners, so they were the ones that got sick the fastest. And so you saw all of these kind of like jock models, people who worked in fashion and the arts, all going from being like the people that are the lead on a Broadway show to being a bag of bones in a year. Where my own boyfriend was a 180-pound, 6'2" varsity tennis player at MIT, blonde, incredible body. He ended up dying at 120 pounds. All of his hair had fallen off. He had wasting syndrome, covered with herpes on his mouth and Kaposi sarcoma, that kind of ugly purple, grayish, callous lesions, a skin cancer all over his face, and it was just a horrifying, frightful disease, and nobody knew what the cause was. Nobody knew how it was spread, how to prevent getting it, how to prevent transmitting it if you have it. Is it airborne? If somebody touches me, if I drink, from a water fountain after them, am I going to get it? So there was all this stigma and discrimination. People were getting fired from their jobs, denied health care, not admitted into hospitals when they were sick. After they died, there were only 2 funeral homes in all of New York City that would embalm and bury somebody who died of AIDS. So people were like piling up in the morgues. They were getting sent to what's called Potter's Field, like a place where people get literally buried in trenches, casket after casket after casket, on top of, and because funeral homes, cemeteries, nobody wanted to take these people, so they were getting shipped in pine boxes from morgues to Potter's Field. So it was frightening because of the lack of knowledge about how it was transmitted, how to prevent it. There was no treatments, no cure, and there were no anti-discrimination laws in place. And so, you could get evicted from your apartment or fired and from a job or denied health insurance or any of those things with no recourse. And so the only people who would care for or try to support people living with HIV were other people who were gay or lesbian or their friends. And so that started a mobilization of the LGBT community to try to respond. And it spurred the formation of things like the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which first was set up as a phone line to educate people who would call and say, I've got this lip thing on my lip, I'm having night sweats, I'm coughing, is this a symptom? Who should I see? What doctors will treat me? And setting up buddy programs where healthy people would be paired with sick people to, help take care of them, to shop for them, cook their meals, go with them to doctor's appointments, walk their dogs, basically try to help people die with dignity, because that's about all you could do at that time. And the only doctors who were treating people were LGBT doctors for the most part. And so the government didn't care. And part of the other reason for the stigma that I didn't mention yet was who was getting it. It was first gays, and then it was IV drug users, and then it was sex workers. So junkie, queers, and whores. Oh, great. The people that are the bottom of the totem pole who, oh my God, nobody will associate with those people. And did the government care about those people? No. And Ronald Reagan was asked in a cabinet meeting by somebody who worked for the Department of Health and Human Services, shouldn't we be doing something about this AIDS stuff about the third year of his first term? And his response was, why? Aren't the right people dying? And everybody in the cabinet, except for that person who asked that, were like, oh. So no, end of conversation. And you can search on the web and see, there's been a lot of it on Facebook right now about press secretaries, making these horrendous comments about people living with AIDS. It was a big joke for them, and that's what drug companies thought too. Who cares if the junkies and the fags die? So the community had to try to mobilize. And one of the first things we tried to do was to put a face on AIDS and go public if we were symptomatic, even before we started looking like those walking skeletons with no hair and big purple lesions, wearing diapers because we had uncontrollable diarrhea. And so, tried to make people realize that, anybody can get this. Eventually, after about 84, they discovered it was a viral transmitted illness that was transmitted by either sharing needles, unscreened blood products, or through unprotected sex. And all of that information, for the large part, was unmined by LGBT doctors just trading information and doing surveys of their patients. All of the first treatments of HIV-related opportunistic infection came out of doctors just sharing observations of what was working in their practices. The Safer Sex Guidelines came up because a guy named Michael Callan started Body Positive and the PWA Coalition, a support group for people living with HIV, and a musician, a guy named Joseph Sonnabam, one of the gay doctors in the city who was treating a lot of gay patients, and a guy named Richard Berkowitz, who was a male sex worker, got together and said, started doing research. They got doctors to do questionnaires with people who were sick in the offices, and after they noticed that boyfriends were getting sick about the same times and about the same time as their ex-boyfriends, or clusters of people that had sex together a lot, were all getting sick about the same time. And so they started saying, well, let's talk to them and figure out are they using drugs? Is it what kind of sex are they having? Blah blah blah. And they started noticing that the people who only engage in oral sex are less likely to have AIDS than people who have anal sex. The bottoms in anal sex are the majority of people who have it. The tops not so much. Unless they're occasional bottoms. And and people who only let other people blow them, they're not sick at all. And so they started putting this together, and they came up with a risk factor, and it was like penetrative anal sex is the most risky. Penetrative vaginal sex is the next step down. Being the recipient or the giver of oral sex is the next level. Only getting oral sex performed on you is very low risk, and if you only masturbate or make out, then you don't have any risk at all. So they literally came up with these guidelines and said, if you have intercourse with a condom, if you're straight, you don't get pregnant. So it's likely that if men do the same thing, they won't transmit whatever's in the semen that's transmitting the virus, because it's people who are getting semen deposited in their butts that are the most likely to get HIV. And so they came up with this how to have sex in an epidemic pamphlet that became the safer sex guidelines that are used all over the world. Similarly, like the AIDS-related pneumonia, PCP pneumonia, people were dying of this, and everybody's like, what the hell? You give antibiotics to somebody with pneumonia and they're fine. What's going on? And some doctors realized that who were treating people for thrush infection, a fungal infection of the mouth, the esophagus. In women, it's the reproductive tract. People who were getting that medication and antibiotics for pneumonia were clearing of the pneumonia. Well, is it the combination, or could this pneumonia be fungal based? So let's try just giving the antifungal medications to the people who had the AIDS pneumonia. Sure enough, they cleared the pneumonia, and so they realized, holy shit, it must be a fungus. So they started doing some lab work and figured out, oh, sure enough, it's a fungus. It's not a bacteria. It's not a viral base. And so a lot of these early treatments came about because of basically community-based clinical trials conducted informally by doctors in their offices. And so that began the practice of the gay community saying, look, you got to involve us in the research and development of treatments and cures, because we're the only ones that got an idea of what's going on. We're the ones that are coming up with with effective treatments. You got to let us have input into the clinical trials to develop the antiretroviral drugs or the the search for a cure. And people with AIDS were dying in a year to 2 years tops. Before they came up with these treatments for the opportunistic infection, it was under a year. Once they came up with some of these treatments for the opportunistic infection, it was 2, maybe 3 years if you're lucky. But people in other countries were experimenting, and the FDA, the drug approval process, FDA's Federal Drug Administration, the drug approval process in other countries is less onerous. Less people have to be in the clinical trials. They are shorter. Less research is done before stuff gets pushed to market. So we started saying, adopt that easier development process, because we're all going to be dead in 2 years. Your clinical trial process at this point takes 10 to 15 years. Give us rat poison if we're going to be dead anyhow. If there's a chance that it's going to save us, we want expanded expedited access to anything that might be effective to help stop the dying. And so that kind of pushed through one of ACT UP's biggest contribution, which is reform of the Federal Drug Administration's drug approval process here in the United States.
Which is a big deal, because that's beyond the AIDS crisis, right? That's presumably something that probably we're all benefiting from now.
Absolutely.
Because the drug approval process has been changed.
Yep.
But it wasn't going to change just by itself. It took a lot. I mean, he said push, but it took a lot, which most of you who saw, How to Survive a Plague, since it does focus on the treatment action group and that work, so you probably are this should sound familiar, some of what you're hearing.
Those big demonstrations were
Right.
taking over the Federal Drug Administration and the National Institute of Health, where the clinical trials were run.
Right. So that gives us, I think, a really incredibly clear and concise introduction to what the AIDS crisis was like and how ACT UP, and what ACT UP was about, why ACT UP formed as a movement and what it accomplished, some of what it accomplished. So before we talk more about that, do you think you could go back and help us understand a little bit about how it came together and how you got involved? Because we've so far been talking about a lot of different social justice issues in New York that are playing out now that feel, I want to say almost every class we come in and whatever we've read, everyone's feeling really depressed about it because the same themes keep coming up over and over again. Like, what are some of the things that we keep finding again and again and again?
Top-down approach.
Top-down approach, what does that mean?
Like, whatever policies that government is implementing is not really considering the feelings or the people that are affected.
Right? So a lot of top-down, disengaged, planning and programming. What else? What are some of the other things? Who has power? Who shapes the city? That shapes the future of New York? Who has the power? What's driving the development of the city? Yeah?
People with money.
Yeah, a lot about people
And
with
big
money.
business, right?
Big business.
Right.
And so this was, this was the beginning of that time, really, when the big money and big business was really starting to take over. But we've been talking about how persistent that has been and how much more entrenched it has become. And each of there's four group projects in the class, and they're all working with community groups who are trying to affect change on some issue. And, they're trying to figure out how to make policy recommendations that do take into account the people's lives and expertise that are most affected by it and are experiencing it. And also to develop popular education materials to help educate more of those people to be able to mobilize. So I think, we're looking at a lot of issues that feel overwhelming in a way that I imagine and understand that the AIDS crisis was. The AIDS crisis was even much more so than a lot of what we're looking at, which is, issues of how bad it was and how far it seemed that activists would need to go. It looked like such an unlikely achievement. So if you could help us understand something about how it came together and your personal involvement.
Sure. Well, one of the things that developed very early were these support groups, PWA coalitions. One of the things that first happened was at a LGBT health conference in Denver, a group of people living with HIV there went off in the evening and had a caucus wanting to bring something about HIV to the agenda because there wasn't anything there. And so they basically went off and wrote a Bill of Rights. It's called the Denver Principle because the conference was based in Denver, but it's basically a Bill of Rights for people living with HIV, and it demanded a bunch of things like what we be called, what are we called? Not victims or sick people or whatever, not things that disempower us, but to basically just say we're people living with AIDS. We're not victims or any kind of derogatory term, and they basically set up a Bill of Rights for patients. And one of the primary principles was nothing for us without us, meaning we're the experts, we know what will work for us, you can't develop any policies or programs or even having discussions about HIV without having us in the room to correct your shit and to be sure whatever you come up with works for us. And that Denver principle actually has evolved to the patient Bill of Rights that you all get when you go to a hospital room, anywhere in the U.S. That came out of the AIDS movement and now is pervasive in any medical intervention. Similarly, when ACT UP began doing demonstrations, we learned really early on that the press was dumb and lazy and you could do a huge demonstration, and all there would be is a picture saying, gays and lesbians demonstrate about AIDS, and that would be like the whole coverage in the paper. And so we started doing all these, like, there's some pretty great graphics you saw in some of those, lots of silence equals death posters, and Ronald Reagan, in green with a you slay me, or AIDS gate language. But we were like, let's do imaging that's really catchy and hot, so that we're sure the picture is going to be that, and have whatever that poster is tell the message of why we're here. The government has blood on its hands. So many AIDS deaths every minute. Men wear condoms or beat it. A number of things like that, so that if we only got a photo, at least the photo would tell the story. And we started putting out press releases and fact sheets. The fact sheet would have the background information about our issue, what all the problems were, and then a list of demands, things we were recommending that if they were adapted would change and improve the situation. So say, I helped start the housing committee, which became Housing Works. There were lots of homeless people with HIV, either because homeless people, engage in drug use or have unprotected sex, or people were evicted or, thrown out of their homes when they got sick because of discrimination. And so, we wanted the city to build medically appropriate housing. They wanted to stick them in shelters, with other medically frail people, like people who have tuberculosis. When tuberculosis is highly infectious for people with AIDS, because T cells are destroyed by HIV, and T cells are what fight tuberculosis. So you put people with TB in a room with people who have HIV and no T cells, you guarantee they're all going to have TB like in a couple of weeks. And so, we developed like a poster that had an armory in the Bronx where 1,000 men were on cots, 3 feet apart in rows, and that's where they were shipping all the people with HIV. And so that you guaranteed with like 1,000 people in one room separated by 3 feet for at least 8 hours, that whatever anybody had, everybody around them was going to get. And so, we had
a Kingsbridge Armory?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. I was just there yesterday.
Yeah, it is. And so, that imagery and, create medically appropriate housing for people with AIDS, was really powerful.
Yeah.
And so, so our fact sheet, when we did demonstrations at that facility or at Housing Preservation and Development, were all about how, people with AIDS are, getting evicted, homeless people, are getting AIDS because of drug use and unprotected sex. They have to be given medically appropriate housing. You can't put them in shelters because they're getting the shit kicked out of them by the staff and other residents because they're afraid of them. Same happened in jails, by the way.
Right.
Or they're going to get, and spread disease amongst, themselves. And so, you have to have medically appropriate housing, with adequate ventilation so they don't spread TB, and, nutritional supplements because they have chronic diarrhea and can't digest food and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So that process of us becoming the expert and not only identifying a problem, but creating, coming up with the solutions, and then say, we're here to help you, develop the programs that will actually address this issue, was what we found to be an effective intervention for change.
It's really amazing, and a lot of the students wrote responses to what they watched in the films, and several students commented on that, exactly what you just described, the process of becoming expert, the importance of that. Isn't it such a clear case? I'm thinking, we've talked about different kinds of knowledge, and the different, there's academic knowledge, and there's knowledge from experience, and then there's community knowledge, and where their projects are really trying to tap into that community knowledge to inform action around certain issues. And I feel like with ACT UP, it's such a clear example of how that community knowledge was developed and mobilized through this process of becoming experts on so many facets of the crisis, right? So in the film, you saw about the Treatment Action Group and all the what you described as community-based clinical trials, which is so fascinating. But then, Eric's focus was around housing. So, and there was just as much that needed to happen, and expertise to develop, and problems to identify, and solutions to propose and demand around housing. And these, this was a crisis that affected every aspect of people's lives, and many people.
Right.
So I think that is especially just such a powerful lesson for us today and for our class. Can you talk to us about how, because we have focused a lot in this class on urban development and planning and housing, can you talk to us about why were you involved in housing, and what was that story?
Well, I got involved in housing for about three main reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One was I'd been a serial brownstone flipper in Harlem for many years, starting in the 1980s. And I actually renovated with a boyfriend an old Victorian house in Denver when I was in graduate school. I had helped my father renovate our farmhouse in upstate New York, one room at a time, as a teenager with my brothers. And so, I liked hands-on renovation types of stuff. I had a boyfriend who was like, let's renovate an old brownstone or an old Victorian in Denver when I was in grad school. And so I started doing that and got the bug. And when I moved to New York, I was paying more for a studio apartment than our mortgage was for this Victorian house in Denver. So I'm like, this is crazy. Where can I find some old abandoned house to fix up? And Harlem was where they were most affordable. So I bought a house. My first renovation, Hillary now owns. And so
That's how we know each other.
That's how we know each other. So I had the skills to do renovation. My boyfriend, who died of AIDS, father died of AIDS a couple of years before him. His father was a sports reporter for the Chicago Tribune, lived in a suburb of Illinois, had a triple bypass operation and got HIV because of unfiltered blood. He came down with AIDS in 82, very shortly, very early on in the epidemic, and died in about 84. And Scott was having to go home to shave him, to bathe him, because he was in a hospital in Homewood, Illinois, a suburb, and the nurses, the doctors, nobody would touch him. Even his own second wife, not Scott's mother, was afraid to bathe him or touch him. And so, Scott would literally have to fly home because he was the only one that would give him a bath or shave him, or, towards the end he had a, breathing tube in his throat, and Scott would go home and it'd be crusted with, throw up and, whatever. I mean, literally they were just letting him die. And so, Scott was like determined that he should never be hospitalized. I don't care if I die a year earlier, I'm not going to live in that inhumane type of setting. And so after he died, and I started realizing how many homeless people were living with AIDS, including a guy, a gay guy who was a friend of ours who lived across the street on Manhattan Avenue, who got sick and was evicted from his apartment because he couldn't pay his bills anymore. And I saw him begging on the streets because, and helped get him in a homeless shelter at a church because he couldn't find anybody to take him in. So I'm like, fuck this! I've got to do something to develop some housing. And that's actually what pulled me into the beginning of ACT UP. Was I called Larry Kramer, who was a friend of mine who I'd known for a long time, who almost bought a brownstone with me as a partner, a year before, and said, do you know anybody who's developing AIDS housing? And he said, yeah, there's this group that is now Bailey House. It was called the AIDS Resources Center then. And he said, I'll introduce you to them, but I'm giving a speech next week where I'm going to call for the formation of a civil disobedience group to try to force the government to do something. So can you come? Can you stand up? Can you volunteer to help be one of the organizers of the first demonstration? And that's what brought me into that group. And shortly after we started ACT UP, in addition to the Treatment and Data Committee that was doing all the work to get treatments, people started bringing other issues. I brought homelessness and AIDS. Women's issues were brought, pediatric AIDS, the lack of food stamps, the lack of access to the Medicaid system. All of these things came in, and so we started forming committees to deal with each of the varying issues. I started the Housing Committee, which became Housing Works, and so the people in the group and people who were in a whole bunch of fields, whether it be medical, social science, housing, homeless organizations, people running food pantries, any number of kind of related things, heard about ACT UP and what it was doing, and so they all started coming to our meetings to bring their issue forward and to get volunteers to help them try to address their problems. And so ACT UP quickly grew from being about 20 of us who organized the first demonstration, and a few hundred showed up after we all called all of our friends, until we each had 10 people at a minimum coming to the first demonstration. And when that first demonstration got huge press for weeks, every meeting we had, would grow by 100 people. And so, it was just kind of right time and right place, and lots of people really pissed off, and nobody doing everything, and everybody who was trying to do something seeing ACT UP as a way to at least draw attention to issues. And so the group exploded. Within a couple of years, there were 116 ACT UP chapters in the U.S. and 23 globally, just because of the press that we were getting. So
yeah. So I think that a lot of what you said is really interesting for a lot of us in the room and for the issues we're working on, also because I don't know that all of us are necessarily activists by, in terms of how we identify. I think a lot of people don't necessarily, I don't know, did you see yourself as an activist?
I was a corporate clone.
Yeah, so this guy was like working in, for corporate New York, right?
I was forced onto long-term disability when I came down with an AIDS diagnosis by a management consulting firm, which my boyfriend, Wall Street lawyer, his Democratic Party firm, kept his secretary employed and sent her to our house every day to care for him while I was at work, while my Republican firm forced me onto long-term disability as soon as I got an AIDS diagnosis, and they were then able to. And so, my boyfriend died on an airplane with that secretary because I couldn't get the day off from work to take him to visit his mother during the week. And I was going to go and bring him home on Sunday. He literally died on a plane with his 25-year-old secretary. That so pissed me off that, after I was forced out of that organization, and Larry gave me this call about becoming an activist, I was really angry and really ready.
So I think that's really important, and you can see that in some of the films, right? You see how people who were, it starts small. There's a few people who are really angry and having a demonstration, and then there are more and more and more, and the people who are joining are not activists, they're just people. But they're people who are angry and ready, or they're people who are affected by and compelled by what they're seeing and that call to stand up.
And
right?
social justice.
And so, right. And so,
equality.
And this idea united in anger, right? There's all this anger, but there's a need to
channel it.
To channel it. And so that's really what ACT UP, one of the things that it was able to do. But I think, the types of just the practices, the way that ACT UP meetings happened, and I remember, I can't now remember which film it was that really talks about how it was also just like the meetings were like the place to be. Like people, it was kind of like also a social.
They were fun.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and so
and it was like, you want to get laid, go to Agda.
Right. So this was also just like where people were getting together and they were having fun, and there was a lot of mutual aid going on, supporting each other, and you know, and people were coming and they were getting information that they needed, and there was a place for them to channel anger, right? And so I think a lot of these things, these kinds of characteristics, you know, can be really helpful to note and to think about just today with a lot of issues that we are discussing, but especially, you know, in your projects when you're thinking about, well, what kinds of recommendations can we make? And popular education, several of the groups, they all presented their proposals last week, and several of them are thinking about making pamphlets, you know, just basic flyers or pamphlets that educate people in the community about what's going on. And so I think this is such an example of how powerful that can be, but also how important it can be for the images to be really good and catchy, provocative, so maybe...
Right. We found street theater was really effective.
Street theater, okay, so that makes me, can you tell this, the HPD story?
Sure. So, you know, we wanted medically appropriate housing collected or developed, and the city was like, oh, you know, the best that we can do is like give you like one wing of the shelter, you know, and give you extra bologna sandwiches because, you know, all those people have wasting syndrome and they're, you know, so skinny. So we'll give them extra bologna sandwiches, and we'll, you know, let them leave later in the morning instead of throwing them out at 8 in the morning, and we'll, you know, we'll let them come back in before 6 o'clock. And you know, we were like, oh, great, that's, you know, really, really, really helpful. And so we started a lawsuit to try to create medically appropriate housing that was independent, that was, it would be the type of housing that we would want to live in. You know, many people were afraid to live in the shelters to begin with because the staff or other shelter mates would, you know, beat them up. And so what was happening is people were living on the street, you know, under bridges, you know, whatever. They'd drag a mattress under a bridge or under an underpass of a road or into the park, and you know, sometimes it would be like an old discarded chair. And so we're like, well, that's what we'll do. We'll create the, you know, what the city is leaving as the alternative housing for people with AIDS right on the street in front of HPD headquarters. So I had a pickup truck. Another guy had a van. I had the building that Hillary lives in, and one that one of her friends lives in, her brother-in-law next door. So I had 2 basements. And in New York at that time, Thursday nights was when you could put out household large items for garbage pickup.
Still is on our block.
Yeah. So Thursday night, we took my truck and this van, and we just started running around, especially the Upper East Side, and collecting mattresses and chairs and couches and, you know, stuff that even like old discarded toilets, and brought them to my basements until we had, you know, 2 vehicles full of them. And then we went down in the middle of rush hour, set up living rooms and bedrooms in the middle of the street in front of HPD, and chained ourselves to them and left the trucks parked there. And so and we did it at rush hour when the evening news is. So maximum traffic impact, make it really hard for the city to bring the dump trucks and the tow trucks to drag us all the way, and guarantee that we're going to be on the news at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and even the national news. And you know, we had all these flyers and people running around, you know, this is the city's, you know, response to our housing homeless people with AIDS. And literally they had to, you know, bring people with bolt cutters to, you know, unchain us from the furniture, and bring garbage trucks after they had arrested us to throw the furniture in, and tow trucks to throw our vehicles away. And so, and it was great street theater. The press loved it. It was all over all the papers. It was in the, you know, the evening news. There were videos of it, you know, for a couple of days. So
it was effective.
It was. Within 2 weeks, the city of New York announced a $25 million capital project for the building of medically appropriate housing for homeless people with AIDS, and the state followed with a $25 million match within a month or so.
I mean, come on, that's like so good. I think that's the other thing about, besides, the education work that ACT UP did and the mutual aid and, the sort of the press to kind of bring awareness of the issue, they also did a lot of direct action. So we haven't talked a lot about that yet. We will talk more about what are the different forms of practice that you could think about in terms of trying to affect an issue. But direct action, civil disobedience, these are things that had been, of course, very important during the civil rights movement, but maybe there hadn't been a lot of it happening around that time prior to ACT UP.
Not about AIDS, for sure.
Certainly in my kind of grassroots organizing education that I've gotten just by being involved in things, what I've always learned is that ACT UP brought that back.
Right.
ACT UP showed what direct action, why we need it, why it's important, and it was very strategic, right? It was very strategic at causing a disruption at a certain time, and
very
it's
targeted.
Very targeted, not just doing it to do it, right?
Right. And I think why it waned so much when, civil disobedience happened a lot in the, the Black equality movement, the anti-war movement, and the anti-Vietnam movement, and the anti-nukes movement. But what killed it to a large degree was things like what happened at Ohio State. Six demonstrators against the Vietnam War were gunned down by
the police repression and the military.
The police and the National Guard. And, you saw in the civil rights movement that, all the beatings and the, people that were shot then and cannons and whatever. And when things like the Democratic convention in Chicago had, people killed and,
Right.
protesting, and, the civil rights movement, there was, lots of people beat up and killed and lynched and whatever, but Black Americans were used to that, and so it didn't really silence them. But those types of things never happened to whites, for God's sake. The police wouldn't dare to do that, and let alone white rich college students. And so when they started killing rich white college students, they stopped.
Mm-hmm. That's what happened when he was talking about what happened at Kent State in Ohio. That's
right.
Who that was. So we're almost out of time, which is devastating to me because I feel like we have so much more to talk about. I want to see. Raise your hand if you have a burning question for Eric. Okay. Tell us what I will have two more things. We haven't really heard you talk about Housing Works or UNH, your work there. And I was also hoping just to have you kind of speak a little bit about where you see the city now in terms of, activism and strategies. But let's hear, what would you, this is Sam, I know she's excited, so let's hear, what would you like to
It's sort of personal, related to queer history and stuff.
Yeah.
That's okay. Sure. I know that this is all very recent history. It was around 1996, which is the year I was born, when AIDS treatment became a little more accessible. But you notice, and I think Sarah Schulman wrote about this in her book, that millennials and Gen Y, queer millennials, this isn't really talked about very widely. I know as a queer individual, I didn't really gain any really real substantial knowledge of the AIDS crisis until I got to college. And I remember last semester, when we read, freshman year, we read a little bit of her book in one of my classes, and a lot of my straight classmates were like, well, she seems kind of crotchety about the fact that, no one's really talking about this, and everyone seems to have kind of forgotten it. Shouldn't she be happy that, the queer community has made progress? And I remember kind of feeling because she was talking about the interviews that she did, with you included in the early 2000s. And I felt like she was justified in being maybe a little quote
Sure.
unquote crotchety. And like, why do you think that is that like such recent queer history has mostly been swept under the rug, even among people in the community who want to know about it?
Well,
Which is very much what her book talks about,
Yeah,
gentrification
interesting.
of the mind.
so
She
it's-
looks at gentrification as a process, as an urban process, but also of our imagination and our cultural history and memory.
I should read that. well, part of the, I think part of what happened was, the media has really short attention span, and people aren't dying ugly deaths anymore, and so the media doesn't talk about HIV anymore, and young people, don't experience losing their friends or seeing people, sick and messy, and so it's not. It's easy to like project it as, that's happening in Africa. It's not happening in the U.S. So I don't need to care about that. But part of it too was a lot of AIDS activists really feel that like the marriage equality movement has co-opted the political space for the LGBT community that was created by the AIDS activists, and there's actually a lot of animosity by AIDS activists that organizations like Human Rights Campaign Fund and some of the other large national LGBT people who are sucking all of the individual contributions out of rich white people, because of marriage equality, have abandoned the HIV epidemic. And there actually have been some demonstrations against the Human Rights Campaign Fund, for example, disrupting some of their $500 a plate dinners at the Wall Street Astoria or the Waldorf Astoria, because they weren't even the last two annual reports of the Human Rights Campaign Fund didn't have the fucking word AIDS in it, and the AIDS activists were like, how fucking dare you? You took our seats at the table, you've taken all of our money from rich white people, and you've abandoned us, and so. That's the source of it. Yeah.
So do you think then, is it also a question of like ACT UP was really effective for as long as it was acting up?
Right.
And
Right.
then, I don't know, what do you
Out of
think
sight, out of mind,
today, how do you think that a lot of the students raised in their responses to the films, how can we learn from this today? How can we use some of these
Right.
tactics today? Can we use these tactics to address other issues?
Absolutely.
So do you have thoughts about that? Concluding thoughts?
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm involved in right now is the creation of a New York City AIDS memorial. There's a park that's kind of in between the LGBT community center and what used to be St. Vincent's Hospital, which was the only hospital in Greenwich Village and one of the few hospitals that would actually. That hospital lost its funding. And was bought by a real estate developer who knocked it down and now is building $1 million condos. There was a lot of pushback to try to save that hospital because it's the only hospital in Lower Manhattan, especially in that area. But those efforts lost to the real estate efforts. They did. There's a big white kind of strange modern-looking building, and this area is 7th Avenue. The park is between 7th Avenue, Greenwich Avenue, and 12th Street. It forms a triangle. Greenwich Avenue is a diagonal street. And there was a park there that literally had a loading dock and a huge elevator that went went underground, and then was what took all of the food and the laundry and everything into St. Vincent's Hospital, and then brought all of the dead bodies and the garbage and stuff out. And so that triangle was partially a park, but mainly, some oxygen tanks that fed oxygen to the hospital and this loading dock. Well, the condos are turning that into a city park. We tried to get that as an AIDS memorial. We didn't get the whole park, but we succeeded in getting the apex of the triangle. And the park is open, and there's a green construction fence, plywood, around what is going to be the memorial. We're lobbying right now to try to get that named the New York City AIDS Memorial Park. Some people want it named other things, including the condo people, because they don't want people having an AIDS park across from their $1 million condos. Anyhow, one of the things we were trying to do was attach to, and we tried to get control of the loading docks and the offices, the warehouses underneath that park, to have a learning center.
Yeah.
And an archive about the history of the AIDS
Amazing.
response, so that people could come and maybe there could be exhibits. That the park, we wanted the AIDS Memorial to be all kind of an open venue, where it was an open amphitheater where performances could be put on and lectures could be given and community organizing meetings could be held. We lost that battle. We just are getting a really big, fancy, expensive monument there. But we're trying to create an online archives and learning center that will basically preserve the history of the AIDS response and how, and quite frankly, the AIDS response has completely changed how public health is done, not only in the U.S., but globally. It's also had a huge impact on development. It's developed things like the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and malaria. It's created the President's Emergency Preparedness Response for AIDS. Two of the largest development funds that are providing billions of dollars for HIV care and prevention in the developing world. Funds like that were never created before. And the whole process for drug approval, generic AIDS drug production, distribution in the developing world, all of that was developed by us, mainly New Yorkers, but also some people from San Francisco and some from Europe. That's another whole class.
Yeah, well, it sounds like, the lesson, one of the takeaways, and we have to close, but it's just that it sounds like, Sam, a lot of this history is not it's not preserved, it's not visible, it's not documented, or if it is, it hasn't been shared in accessible ways. So I think these are all lessons for us to take, as well as the broader impacts of what can start as a really small, seemingly futile effort that then changes how public health is done. So thank you so much, Eric.
Sure.